Hey everybody, this is Dream, and today we've got an 8-game slate that starts at 7 o'clock. We're going to go through each each position's players. We have 4 games that are stackable. Houston Astros, LA Dodgers, Philadelphia Phillies, and the Toronto Blue Jays. But all 4 of those teams are going to have guys that you're probably going to want to have in your stacks if you just decide to go with that team stack. And then the 2 teams that you're definitely going to want to avoid for the most part are going to be the Angels and Minnesota. Obviously, Mike Trout's an exception, and so is Ohtani. But and then both those 2 teams probably going up against the toughest pitchers, so they're not going to have very much value there for the most part. You're definitely going to see a lot of Houston, LA Dodgers, Philly, and Toronto throughout this position situation. And there's some good pitchers, top tier, middle rank at least, and one lower price guy that could pay off if you decide to use them. My top 2 pitchers are McClanahan and Framber Valdez. They both have really high upside. McClanahan is definitely better just because he's done very well against LA in the past, including a 35 fantasy point game the last time that included 11 strikeouts. So he's been really solid this season, striking people out, and he's number 1 in the highest expectation for today, as well as the lowest runs against today. So he's definitely going to be my top pitcher. And then Framber Valdez, he's my second favorite. He's not as crisp as McClanahan, but he's still a pretty solid option. Granted, he's expensive almost as Shane, but he's probably the number 2 option. He doesn't have the best matchup though, going up against Minnesota, which he hadn't seen. But he's pretty safe. I mean, you might get a couple bad games from him occasionally, but he's a pretty safe option. Then I have 2 pitchers that are a little bit cheaper. One's just barely cheaper, and one's quite a bit cheaper. And these are my second tier choices. And the first one is Zach Gallen. He does flash the upside, and he's been really good the last 3 starts. You can see he's been plus 30 over the last 3 games he's played, and he's been throwing lots of good strikeouts and not allowed many hits. Granted, they're not against very good teams, but doing that in Colorado is actually pretty impressive at Colorado, which he did. But still, Kansas City's not a very good team, so he has the potential to do that. Obviously he has more bad games than your top 2 guys has typically, but he's a pretty good pitcher, so you're going to be okay probably if you utilize him and if you want to save a little money. But again, it's not a ton of savings, but he's a pretty decent option. And then the other one is Jose Berrios against Boston. He's not a great pitcher all the time, but when he's on, he can sometimes, hit 30 points. And so that's kind of what I'm looking at here. There's just not a lot of great pitchers other than the top 3, really. And then this guy, potentially, against Boston, who has a lot of hit-or-miss situations. He could also just be terrible today. But he's averaging 18 points per game against Boston. He's quite a bit less expensive than the other 3. So he's a good option as an alternative if you need to save money at pitching. Of course, I definitely don't really recommend that. I typically say to go with the guys that have the best matchups and the best strikeouts and stuff like that. But he might be a guy you want to turn to, excuse me, if you need to save some money there. So let's go ahead and get in the catchers. I have 3 catchers picked out here, and there's really just not much else available. Just based on matchups and stuff like that. So Will Smith is obviously the number 1. He has high potential. He's been averaging 8.5 points per game. He's got stack potential, and he can probably get a home run in a game like that against a weaker pitcher. JT Realmuto is also on my board, and he's also around 8 fantasy points per game of the last 10. He's really been doing well the last 5 or 6 as well, so he's definitely somebody that I'm looking at. Granted, he's pretty expensive as well. And then if you just need to pay down a little bit but you do need the potential for a home run, Mr. Kirk is going to do that. He's not been quite as good as the other 2, but he does have home run potential, especially against weaker pitchers. So those are my 3 catchers. Unfortunately, there just wasn't a whole lot available that was less expensive. The only guy that I would say that really fits that is Bethencourt, but he definitely has been pretty good the last 3 games. As you can see, he's hit a home run 3 games in a row, and so if you want to, hope that he can continue that, three of his 8 total home runs in the last 3 games. If you think he can continue that, then maybe he's a guy you could fly out there. But overall, these top 3 are going to be the best ones available, and I would probably steer clear of anybody else, if you can manage it at least. Then the first base. We actually have quite a few first basemen, which seems to be the case a lot of times. There's usually a pretty good amount of first base available that's pretty good. My top 2 picks are going to be, I can't see him here, Keston Hiura for Milwaukee. Milwaukee looks really solid today, despite the fact that they're not really the, a stackable team necessarily. They're kind of a secondary stack, but they've got several guys that are really hitting the ball well, and he's one of them. He's averaging 9.3 last 10 games, which is always nice, and he's had some big ones, including a 2 home run game. So he's definitely somebody to look at, and he's pretty inexpensive too, so that's a nice advantage. The other first baseman that I really like today is Jose Abreu for the White Sox. Again, he's really been kind of coming on as of late, averaging 8.1. And he does strike out some, but he's got a good batting average, so it's hard to complain too much about what he does, because let's see, 7 strikeouts in 10 games, not bad. And he's been really, he's had a couple zeros, but for the most part, he's got really solid chance to get to 10 in a lot of situations. I will say that he is he's also pretty inexpensive for what he can bring production-wise. Then I have 2 cheap options. One of them is Choi for the Tampa Bay Rays, and he's been kind of in a slump, but it's kind of the situation where he could really kind of boost out of it. And he does have home run potential, but he's a little risky. He kind of reminds me of how O'Neal Cruz felt for Pittsburgh for last week. Kind of in the same boat there. And then Gurriel for Houston. He's going up against Bandy, and I was like going up against that guy. He's been kind of hitting the ball better as of late, and he's kind of in a stackable situation. Probably not the most ideal option, but he's cheap, and he's been hitting the ball well and stackable, so that's kind of a trifecta of good ideas. And then we have obviously Hoskins, from Philadelphia, who's in a stackable situation. He's been hitting the ball well. He is a little bit more expensive, but if you can afford him against a bad pitcher, then he's definitely a good option. And then the final option that I have is a secondary option, which is Trey Mancini. He's been hitting the ball pretty good since he came to Houston, and he likes to hit home runs. I've always liked watching this guy play because he does have some nice power and stuff. He doesn't play every day for Houston, so that does kind of hurt him a little bit. As you can see that he can't really get in a good groove, but he has individual home run potential, and I definitely like guys at that that are that way. Granted, he's a little more expensive than Hiura, and he's the same price as Abreu, and I definitely go with one of those guys over them. But if he plays and you like him a lot, then he's somebody that you got to give an eye to, and so that's why I included him on the list. As for second base, I didn't have a whole lot here, but I have 3 guys at different price ranges that you can look at to come to some conclusion with. The first one would be Segura for Philadelphia. Again, they've got a good smash potential game, and he's a guy that can smash occasionally. He's been pretty good the last 10 games as well. Not the best, but he's still pretty solid up there. Like I said, second base is pretty weak today, and you're just trying to find guys that can get on base and get points scored for you at these middle infield positions, and so sometimes you kind of have to dig around a little bit. Then my other top tier option is going to be Jose Altuve for obvious reasons. He's a Jose Altuve, and he's in a stackable situation against a blah pitcher. and so we have an advantage with him there. Granted, he's expensive, so you're going to have to work some magic in our lineup to fit him, but if you can, you probably won't be too disappointed. I have one more guy, and he can actually play second and third base, and he's a little bit less expensive, and that's Luis Urias. Where is he? Here he is. He's a little bit cheaper, though he doesn't always hit home. He doesn't have the best batting average, as you can see, and he's been about 5 points per game, but he has a high upside situation, kind of just based on his ability. And so if you think he can kind of break out, then he's a good cheaper option if you really need it. There's just not a lot of good cheaper options at this position, unfortunately. We've been blessed with having Atlanta in the lineups the last few games, few days rather, and being able to throw Von Grisham in at second base. We don't have that today, so it's a little bit more slim pickings than normal. As for third base, we have actually quite a few guys that are good options. The first top two are going to be my top tier options, and one of those is Justin Turner for the Dodgers, obviously in a good situation. He doesn't really hit the home runs like we would like, but he still has potential, and he does hit the ball well. He's been hitting it really well lately, in fact. Lots of 10s plus there on the board, and so he's one of my top tier options. My other top tier option is Alec Bohm for the Philly. Again, another option when it comes to being stackable, and he's been really solid the last 10 games, and he's got some home run potential against a kind of bad team and a really bad pitcher today, probably. So then, of course, we have Luis Urias, who I mentioned earlier, at second base. I don't know that you really want to use him at third base unless you just want to throw Altuve in there and then you need a cheap option. But honestly, I feel like you have better options at third base than him. Another secondary option is Max Muncy, who probably doesn't have the best batting average, obviously. And I feel like Justin Turner would be better if you're trying to choose between them, especially for stacking purposes. But he does have a higher chance of home run than Turner does, but it's not a whole lot, and he's not going to give you a lot of base hits. At least not likely. So you're going to have to hope that he hits home run if you decide to use him. Another guy that I like that's super cheap, which is, I've not really ever used this guy before, but he looks really interesting today, is Emmanuel Rivera. He has been on fire lately, averaging 10 fantasy points a game. He's got 3 home runs the last 10 games, and as you can see, he's been getting on base and keeping points scored for most of the games. Had a couple bad ones, but he's not a perfect player, but he's got a pretty decent matchup, and he can be somebody you could load in if he's super cheap that you need. My super expensive option for this particular game is for third base is Alex Bregman. This dude is averaging 15 fantasy points per game over the last 10, and he's had 5 home runs in those games. And as you can see, he had a game where he had 55 points against Chicago White Sox, and then he had a 24-point game, I think, yesterday. So he's been really smashing the ball well. Lots of big scorers here. And he's definitely somebody, as far as expensive guys, he's probably one of my favorite ones in the entire matchup. However, he's just extremely expensive. So there's actually guys that are more expensive than him that are kind of how are they more expensive than this guy? But you're gonna pay for that production in his case, and he might be worth it. At shortstop, again, another situation where we just don't have a ton of guys to choose from, but luckily we have a really solid option with a stackable player in Jeremy Pena. He's been a little bit slumpy as of late, but he started to turn it on the last 10 or 15 games, and he's really been good against Minnesota, so I like him in this particular game. As you can see, he had a slump there kind of at the beginning of the month and into the previous month, but he seems like maybe he's gotten out of that a little bit, and he's starting to score points again. I do like him, and he's also pretty inexpensive at $3,800, and pretty much everybody else at this position that's going to be useful is going to be quite a bit more expensive. So he's definitely probably your top option. I have 3 other players: Xander Bogaerts, Trey Turner, and then Bo Bichette. Um, if I had to order them, I would say Turner, Bichette, and then Bogarts. But Bogarts is probably in the worst position when it comes to the pitcher he's facing. And then Turner's just overtly expensive at $6,100. Doesn't really match the production that he's been doing the last 10 games, especially. But he's still gotten, some 10, 11, and 17-point games, so he definitely can score the points. But I'm not sure that you're going to want to play $6,100 for him unless you just got the money. And as for Bo Bichette, he's not been as good as of lately, but he's got a nice matchup situation where he could kind of get back on track. He's been a guy that I've used all season off and on in certain situations, and as you can tell, he does have that potential, with 17 home runs. So he's a pretty good option. But, he's going to be hit or miss sometimes, especially lately being a little slumpy. But he's got a good situation to potentially blow out, poke out of it. In the outfield, we've got a lot of good options available. I have 5 top tier options, and then 5 cheaper options, and then an expensive option who I really like as well. And so just to kind of start with those guys, we have Kyle Tucker, Nick Castellanos, Andrew McCutchen, Jordan Alvarez, and Hunter Renfroe. As for Kyle Tucker, he's averaging 11 points over the last 10, and he's stackable. That also is true for Nick Castellanos, who's a little bit less expensive by $100. Let's see if I can find him here so I can show you those two guys. Tucker here, he's going to have the potential for a home run or two. And then Castellanos is a little bit weaker of a player, but he's really been hitting the ball well. And so you like guys that hit the ball well that are in stackable situations. And then for some cheaper option, Andrew McCutchen and also Hunter Renfroe, I mentioned from Milwaukee. Like I said, they seem to be a little bit underpriced for what they typically do, which could be to do with the matchup. But overall, I just like the possibilities with these guys. And so I didn't really think that Milwaukee was going to be a team that was going to go after too much, but they are going up against Haney. And, he has been pretty good this season. But I feel like that he isn't a perfect pitcher by any stretch. And he gives up some runs occasionally, especially the last 2 games. He does get some strikeouts sometimes, but I still like them in that matchup. And so those guys I definitely like. Another guy that I really like is Jordan Alvarez. Obviously, he's one of the best players in baseball this season. But he had some health issues that seem to be over with. And so he might be somebody, if you got the money to pay up for him, that you might be interested in. So he'd be somebody that's still kind of stackable, probably a little bit less stackable though than some of the other Houston players. And then for 5 cheap guys, I have David Peralta, who has been super cheap, and he has decent ability. And then I also have Chase McCormick, which I don't think I typically ever talk about him too much. He's only $2,200. And he's been hitting the ball really well lately. So if he plays, he might be a good option to, kind of a dart throw, just because of his price and his production. I'll show you what he's done lately. He's been averaging 8 fantasy points a game last 10. Got a home run, a triple, a double. He does, strike out some, but overall, he's been doing pretty solid, and he's had some really good games. So he might be an interesting guy if you just really need to save money to throw there. Jake McCarthy is another one that kind of fits in a similar box. He's been averaging 10 fantasy points a game, and he doesn't really hit home runs, but he's still getting points, as you can see. So that's what you like a player to do. If they're not going to hit home runs, it'd be scoring points. Then the last 2 cheap options are Alex Verdugo, who I've mentioned in the past in a lot of videos, because he's somebody who does seem to get good amount of hits. He's at 7.7 the last 10, and he's been playing pretty well. He had 2 bad games in a row, but hopefully he can recover and start getting home runs again. And then Franmil Reyes for the Chicago Cubs. He doesn't have the most ideal situation, and he's not the best batter, but he's been pretty good lately. So you just need him to, he's got to get some hits if you're going to do well with him. like I said, it's not the best option, but he's, cheap at $3,100, so, somebody to think about. And then my super expensive option outside of Alvarez is going to be Luis Robert. He actually has been a bright spot all season for the White Sox, especially, and as they get going, he seems like he's really doing well. So that's why I wanted to include him. So overall, I feel like this is a pretty good slate. I feel like that there's a lot of drop-off, like after the top 2 or 3 guys at each position, especially, which is a little unusual, and there's probably a little bit weaker at catcher, second base, and shortstop than I'd like. But overall, there's good enough options available, and I think you could probably make a pretty rounded lineup with some cheaper options and then some more expensive options, especially if you decide to pay down for a pitcher. Granted, I still like the top 2 pitchers the most, and so you're probably going to have to get some creativity with some of the batters in order to fit everybody that you want. So with that being said, thank you for liking, commenting, and subscribing, and I hope you enjoyed the video, and have a nice day, guys.